All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Kevin Gosztola, and he is the managing editor at Shadowproof.com. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking a lot about whistleblowers, specifically US-based whistleblowers. We're going to dive into Wikileaks and Julian Assange, probably touch on some other whistleblowers as well, such as Edward Snowden and Reality Winner. But before we do, why don't you briefly tell the listeners what types of topics you cover at Shadowproof?
For the most part, I focus on whistleblowing stories, and I have a newsletter that I curate over at Substack for that helps push out the journalism that I'm doing at Shadowproof. And I'm regularly focused on developments with Julian Assange's case and WikiLeaks. And then aside from that, if I have time, I focus on national security or U.S. foreign policy stories coming at things from that angle. So and then as the managing editor of Shadowproof, more generically, our organization also has some focus on prison issues. My colleague Brian Sonnenstein has a podcast called Beyond Prisons, and then we publish people who will give us writing about incarcerated individuals and issues related to prisons and I'd say defunding prisons and police, or putting less investment in prisons and police.
Okay, and we want to get to some recent news regarding the Assange case. But for the few listeners out there who aren't aware of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, we're going to do a little brief background here. So why don't we start by you explaining to listeners, what is WikiLeaks?
WikiLeaks is a leak submission organization. It's a organization that started back around 2007, and the people there now are not necessarily all the people who founded WikiLeaks, but it was set up as a kind of organization that could force government transparency and encourage people from countries around the world to pass along documents that they believed needed to be in the public, and that were in the public interest to read. And it's actually become a model that was incorporated into a number of media organizations set up with the Secure Drop, which allows people to submit leaked documents to their media outlets.
And what are some of those big stories that we're going to probably touch on, but what are some of the big stories that WikiLeaks has broken over the last 10 years?
I'll start with what's at the focus of this criminal case that the Justice Department is bringing against Julian Assange, because it's actually where they received their best reputation. That's how they had their best reputation. It was the Collateral murder video, which had a video of the 2007 of this Apache helicopter attack that took place in Baghdad. Two Reuters journalists or two Reuters employees were killed. It shows a van that pulls up to rescue them. That it's a father has children in the van. It gets attacked and destroyed by the U.S. military. There's the war logs, the Afghanistan and Iraq war logs, exposing that 15,000 Iraqi civilian deaths had not been counted. They were not previously known to the world. There's an order to hide torture or not hold people accountable in Iraq for torture if they're in the Iraqi military. We see evidence of an assassination squad in Afghanistan in the Afghanistan war logs. With the diplomatic cables, it's over 250,000 cables. There are literally thousands of stories to come from them. But there was evidence of drone strikes there. There was evidence of the U.S. government interfering in the Justice Departments of European countries who were interested in investigating U.S. torture and the CIA torture and rendition program. And so these are the big stories that gave WikiLeaks the reputation in which they won awards. At that period, they were winning awards. They were not treated as kind of outcast organization that they are. They were not a pariah organization as they are today in journalism. They've published materials like the Trans-Pacific Partnership documents. They've published evidence of officials being targeted by the NSA. They've published Vault 7 materials, which were cyber warfare tools that evidence of cyber warfare tools that the CIA had. There's other documents that we could get into. The Clinton campaign emails, the Podesta emails, as they were called, and that's had an effect. People view their organization, and before that, there was a disclosure, a leak that involved Kenya. That was one of their very first leaks. There were bank documents that they were pursuing. And they've also published entire caches of material. There's a Stratfor emails. They've actually published Sarah Palin emails from the hack. They've published Sony emails. They get these caches of documents. And one thing that's important to understand about WikiLeaks is they believe in something called scientific journalism, where you publish all the source material so that you can see what is behind reporting, and so that the public can also go through it themselves and benefit from this material.
Right. And Chelsea Manning was the whistleblower who provided those video evidence of what was going on in Afghanistan, where the 2 Reuters journalists were killed. And for listeners, you can go find that video online. You'll have to have a strong stomach because it is really hard to watch, but you can still find that today. And the only reason that we really know about this is because of the publication from WikiLeaks. So what we're going to be talking about today is Julian Assange, who is really at the center of WikiLeaks. You can call him kind of this original CEO/founder. And he has kind of become a pariah in journalism as of lately for people who are maybe skeptical that he is a journalist and that WikiLeaks is a publication, and we'll get into that. But what is it you think that really put Julian Assange on the map? Was it this case with Chelsea Manning, this evidence video?
Yeah, I do think that it was the disclosures from Chelsea Manning that gave WikiLeaks the kind of, it's what made the US government take notice of them as a threat. If we really want to assess why the US government decided that WikiLeaks wasn't just this kind of dissident media organization, this kind of activist outlet that could be tolerated, it's because what they advertised effectively could undermine what the United States is trying to do in the world. It's a very powerful thing to put out there and say to anybody who is an insider anywhere in the world. I mean, this isn't just applied to the United States, but the United States takes this the most seriously, it would seem, has used its power to go after Assange. But any country could be of the mind that WikiLeaks was threatening to them and they needed to stop it, because what they're saying is if an insider in any government gives us this material, we would have a responsibility to go through that and publish it and to do a story to expose to the world what corruption existed within that government. I mean, we've seen Syria files that were published. We've seen documents that have targeted and implicated corporations as well. And so, the idea here is that after those publications in 2010, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks ended up basically facing a kind of war by the intelligence agencies as their communications were targeted, as we saw that Joe Lieberman challenged whether donations could continue to be processed by PayPal and the credit card companies in order to help WikiLeaks receive funding, because it had adopted a kind of grassroots model for funding. There were people who are, well endowed or have wealth that were willing to give to WikiLeaks, but they also wanted to depend on people around the world to fund WikiLeaks. And that source of funding was temporarily disrupted by political efforts to kneecap them, and then we saw efforts to target websites, issues over server hosts, and the communications of people who were WikiLeaks associates were targeted for investigation and subpoena. There was a very major Twitter subpoena lawsuit where the targets who could potentially be alleged co-conspirators in this case had challenged that and fought the government as they tried to get their communications through Twitter. So it set off a saga in 2010 with the grand jury being impaneled that eventually issued these charges against Julian Assange. That's, these disclosures that we talk about, the war logs, the Collateral murder video, the cables, that's really where this case begins.
Okay, and this is a bit of a tangent, so we won't spend too much time on this, but is it true that when PayPal no longer was allowing direct donations to WikiLeaks and WikiLeaks was trying to still maintain this grassroots funding support, that they actually turned to accepting Bitcoin, and that then Bitcoin shot up in value and actually helped essentially this move backfired and allowed WikiLeaks to have even more funding than they would have?
I don't know particularly, but I do know that something that WikiLeaks could be said to have been at the forefront is accepting cryptocurrency as a way of funding. I mean, I think back 10 years ago, it was completely unheard of. It's a little bit more widespread now, especially as Bitcoin becomes an instrument that's accepted even on Wall Street. But now, if you go back 10 years, it's like, yeah, I think I don't know if that had anything to do with how things changed, but back then it would have been unheard of for an organization to say we'll be funded by Bitcoin.
Right. So let's dive now into the charges against Julian Assange. So can you clarify what the charges are against Assange? Who are the charges being made by? And are they just targeted at Assange or also separate charges at WikiLeaks itself?
What you see in the indictment from the Justice Department are 17 charges that are under the U.S. Espionage Act. And this is the 1917 law that has been in force for over a century now. It always has targeted dissenters. Particularly, it was aimed at people who were protesting U.S. involvement in World War I. And in recent years, it's been turned against whistleblowers. And then there's the computer crime offense, the conspiracy to commit a computer crime. And that's where you hear things like Julian Assange conspired with Chelsea Manning to crack a password. And then that's it for the charges. But there's other allegations that have been tacked on to it. In 2020, they added allegations related to WikiLeaks assisting Edward Snowden, allegedly being involved in hacking that was done by LulzSec, and also criminalizing speeches that he gave at technology conferences, or you could call them hacker conferences. And then, and so those are basically the charges that Julian Assange faces. But there are unindicted co-conspirators who are named in the latest indictment that was issued in 2020, and this came just weeks before the extradition trial. And actually, we know those individuals. Their names are Sarah Harrison, who helped Edward Snowden leave Hong Kong, flew with him and was with him when he became stuck in the Moscow airport because the State Department revoked his passport. And then there's Jacob Appelbaum, who had, at least on one occasion, represented WikiLeaks at a conference, at a tech conference when Julian Assange was not able to make it. And then there's Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who had the fallout, who was a partner of Julian Assange. And then there was a lot of differences, and it was really ugly because he apparently stole material too when he left the WikiLeaks organization, or is at least alleged to have done so. And so he's named in the indictment as well. So we have these three individuals, but none of them facing charges at this point.
Okay, and the people who have been following this case have seen pictures and video probably of Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, looking out this one little window that he has. Can we catch up now? Can you tell us how long was he in Ecuador, and how did he end up in this Belmarsh prison?
He was in the embassy from 2012, the summertime, I think it was July 2012, all the way through to April 2019. So that's very nearly 7 years that he lived in the embassy, having sought political asylum from the Ecuador government when Rafael Correa was president of Ecuador. And he was there believing that he would face persecution and be extradited to the United States if he did not seek asylum. And he was, well, when Lenin Moreno was elected in Ecuador, the treatment became harsh, and a pressure campaign was carried out against him to force him to leave the embassy. The government was more friendly to the US government and was communicating with the Trump administration. So he had his citizenship revoked. He was granted citizenship by the Ecuador government. That was revoked, the asylum revoked, and he no longer had the status to stay in the embassy. The British authorities came in, hauled him out, put him in a police van, and took him to the Belmarsh High Security Prison, where he's been detained since April 2019, and that he's never been out on house arrest. He was charged with jumping bail when he went to seek political asylum, and he served a 50-week sentence. And then once that was completed, he was kept in the Belmarsh prison, where he has been detained. And despite prevailing in the extradition case, the judge has denied him bail once more. And despite the pandemic, the judge has never allowed him to be released to house arrest.
Right. And so let's talk a little bit about why people like Assange and Snowden are reluctant to be willing to come back to the United States to face trial. And it's something you mentioned earlier, which is the Espionage Act. Why don't you explain what is this kind of older law, and how is it going to be applied to people like Assange and Snowden?
The Espionage Act, basically, as it is written, would criminalize the receipt of national defense information to a person who is unauthorized to receive it, or the disclosure of that information. And so, technically speaking, what the government does whenever they have a government official who commits a leak, they have the ability to bring a case against that person for violating their security clearance because you sign a non-disclosure agreement. And so what they do to people who, technically speaking, are media sources, it doesn't matter whether we agree that they're whistleblowers. It doesn't matter if we see them as leakers or government propagandists or whatever we want to say about them. They could be egotists, or we could say that they're just out for themselves. It doesn't matter, because they're sources. They are providing material to news organizations. And the history of journalism is filled with people leaking to media organizations in order for us to know what our government is doing behind closed doors, and in many cases hiding from us. And so what they're saying is, once you do this, you have committed an offense, you have committed a crime, and you could be put in prison for up to 10 years. You know, each Espionage Act charge has a potential for 10 years in prison. And then that's where you get this maximum sentence of 175 years that people are talking about for Julian Assange, because it's 17 Espionage Act offenses, and then there's 5 for the conspiracy to commit a computer crime. And so It's a very serious allegation. It is a felony, and to say it's not necessarily treason, but I'd say it's just below treason because they're not charging him with aiding the enemy. Chelsea Manning was charged with aiding the enemy, but they are saying that he was working to injure the United States or to advantage a foreign power that might be against the United States by basically by making this information available to people who could do harm to the United States. I'm just articulating the U.S. case. This isn't my view, but we should recognize that this is unprecedented. It's not something that the U.S. government has ever done to charge and indict a journalist. To reach this point, there have been threats of bringing Espionage Act cases against publishers before, but they've never gotten so far as to actually carry out the indictment and then to fight for the extradition of a journalist abroad. To me, is an uncharted territory that is disturbing for the fact that he is not a U.S. citizen. So I don't know why he should have to follow U.S. secrecy regulations or guidelines in the way that, I might be told I need to because I am a U.S. citizen. He's an Australian. His duty, to the extent he has any duty to any country, would be to Australia, not the United States. And yet he faces this indictment. And if he is brought to the United States and put successfully on trial, I think this is where you wanted me to go in my answer. If he was in a courtroom, he would not be able to make a public interest defense because, as you're saying, and in your question, Edward Snowden and Assange both would prefer not to be in that courtroom because they know they would not receive a fair trial. They would not be able to make a case that what they were doing was whistleblowing. Or in the case of Julian Assange, he would not be able to express his motivations for publishing that information because it's not a part of the charges. It doesn't matter. I mean, what you have to say about why you did it does not factor into whether you are guilty of committing a violation of the Espionage Act. And that's how the Justice Department has prosecuted and won their cases.
Right. And I know that Edward Snowden has said publicly over and over again that if they drop the Espionage Act, that he would happily come back and face trial so that he can talk about why what he did was in the public interest. I'm pretty sure Assange feels similarly. Maybe you can speak to that really quickly.
Well, I don't think he believes he should be prosecuted. So there's a difference here between Assange and Snowden. I mean, I think you're hitting on it, which is Edward Snowden technically did violate. I think he understands why there would be consequences. There's no grounds at all for consequences for Julian Assange. I mean, he had no duty to uphold any guidelines around a security clearance. I think that's what's dangerous here is that the government is saying that I don't have to have a security clearance. They're not saying, they're saying basically that if this material is disclosed to me because I don't have a security clearance, if the first thing I do isn't getting on the phone to the Justice Department and ratting on the source, then I'm a conspirator. I'm somebody who could be accused of being involved in a criminal action against the U.S. government because I don't have a need to know. I don't have the right to be looking at this information. And that's not how journalism has ever worked. And it's not how it should work.
Right. And would you say that because of that, this could be perceived as the biggest threat to journalism right now?
I think if it's not the biggest, it's one of the biggest because it is giving the United States a tremendous power on the world stage to intimidate and harass any journalists who would dare challenge U.S. government policies. And mind you, it could be people who are antagonizing and seek to undermine the U.S. government, or it could be people who are just working for Al Jazeera English, or it could be people who are working for the BBC, or it could be people who are working for more reputable outlets, although they may be able to discourage the U.S. government because they have legal counsels and can make a case to the Justice Department to avoid pursuing them. But I think, to me, what it really signals is that independent journalists throughout the world, people who are not part of media organizations, people who are part of newer media organizations, who are part of public disclosure organizations, or who hold themselves out as leaktivists. Because one thing I'll add to our conversation here is that back last year in 2020, there was a counterintelligence document that I've referenced in my work that President Donald Trump signed off on that said that public disclosure organizations and leaktivists were one of the threats to the United States, along with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all our official enemies on that list. But they believe that public disclosure organizations present a threat to the United States government, and WikiLeaks being one of them to target. And so I think it's a signal that the U.S. government will come after you, and feels that it can come after you, especially if this case is not stopped.
Yeah, even if Assange never faces trial in the US, as well as Snowden, just the fact that he's had to live in the Ecuadorian embassy for so long and been held up for so long is a huge deterrent to any future whistleblowers. Let's dive in now to this recent news. So a British judge, while Assange is in this Belmarsh prison, ruled against extraditing Assange to the United States. We'll get into why this judge decided against that. But then soon after also denied Assange bail. And so he is still in this Belmarsh prison. Now let's dive into why the judge made her decision to deny extraditing Assange to the United States. It has something to do with Assange's mental health, and anyone can imagine how exhausted and how the mental health case that he might have after all that he's been through. And so it has something to do with him being a potential suicide risk, and the judge deeming that the US prison system wouldn't be able to adequately protect Assange from harming himself and committing suicide, possibly. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. What she believes is, as she reviewed the evidence that was introduced by Julian Assange's legal team, she was convinced that the U.S. government had failed to assure her that Julian Assange would not be put in a supermax prison. And the supermax prison we're referring to is ADX Florence, Colorado. It's where I believe El Chapo is, and there are other terrorists who have been convicted of serious offenses who are held there. It's a maximum security prison, as noted by the supermax title, and there are people who are kept in special administrative measures, and the government didn't say that Julian Assange wouldn't be put under special administrative measures, or SAMs. And that's essentially like solitary confinement plus, where you are in your cell 22 to 23 hours a day, very limited recreation, maybe get two 15-minute phone calls a month. You have like maybe 3 or 4 people you're cleared to be able to contact. You can't receive mail from anyone except maybe people who are on your list, and the mail that you do receive is inspected by the FBI, and it takes multiple months to reach you. It's difficult to even get into contact with your attorney, so good luck working on appeals. And this is where he would go after trial if he was convicted, but he could be put under special administrative measures when under pretrial detention. If he was brought to the United States, he would go to the Alexandria Detention Center, and that facility is the same facility that Chelsea Manning was held in for a year when she was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury and resisted. And at the end of her time at this facility, she attempted suicide, and that was mentioned in the judge's decision as part of why she had to reject the extradition request. She does not believe that these authorities would successfully prevent Julian Assange from attempting to take his life. And as you're saying, his health has greatly deteriorated. He has a recurring depressive disorder. He also is diagnosed with being on the autism spectrum. And that kind of a diagnosis has helped people avoid extradition to the United States. There are a couple individuals accused of hacking offenses, serious hacking offenses, Lori Love and Gary McKinnon, in the last 20 years, who were able to win their extradition cases by raising their mental health issues as a serious consideration that had to be weighed against the risk of something brutal and cruel happening to them if they were allowed to be put into general population in a U.S. prison, or if they were even put into solitary confinement conditions in a U.S. prison.
Right. And this British judge who ruled against the extradition, she left the door open for the U.S. to, my understanding, to appeal the decision and basically come back with more evidence that they would be able to manage the health of Assange should he be extradited. And so in a way, this has actually just been kind of kicked down the road a bit, and it's not necessarily the case that he won't be extradited.
Yes and no. I think that, and this is my opinion based on my coverage of the case, but I think that on one hand, it's a very narrow set of issues that this appeal is going to hear. So if you're Julian Assange's people, what you feel good about is it's not going to be a matter of the High Court of Justice, which will hear the appeal, determining that the judge was wrong about how she ruled against an Espionage Act offense or how she ruled against a computer crime charge. But it's just going to be focused on the state of the U.S. prison system. And I think that it's going to be difficult to persuade this panel that the U.S. justice system or the U.S. incarceration system isn't cruel and inhumane, because our record is very well known to the world. And our human rights, the United Nations has done its own investigations and dug into the way we treat people who are kept in jails and prisons. And it's not great. It doesn't make us look good as far as our reputation goes. And then, you know, these are doctors who diagnosed Julian Assange, and so they can disagree with whether his mental health is that severe, and if that it has deteriorated that much, and that he is that much of a suicide risk. They can dispute that. But remember, this is a doctor who has a PhD, who has his own professional expertise. And you get into, I think, sticky territory when you're suggesting that that doctor was wrong in his assessment of Julian Assange. So I'm not sure how the U.S. attorneys just so we're clear for people who are listening to us, the Crown Prosecution Service, these are British attorneys that argue on behalf of the U.S. government. They represent the U.S. government interests in the case, and they go before the British court system to challenge what the Assange legal team is saying. And, you know, now the burden is going to be on the U.S. government. When they were in the district court, the burden was on the Assange legal team to prove that the extradition request should not move forward. Now it's going to be on the U.S. government to prove that the extradition should not be denied, which is a big development for the legal team, because what they have to do is just create doubt that there should be an overturning of the judge's decision. But I think what you're saying is also a fair way to look at it, is that the Justice Department has an opportunity now to look at the things that were deficient about their argument related to prisons and Assange's mental health, and come before the court and try and put forward assurances that Julian Assange will be treated well if he's extradited to the United States. The only small issue is you can't enter new evidence into the record. It has to all come from the body of evidence that was in the original case. So an appeal is an argument over what took place in the district court. And so if there's anything new that they need to get in there to prove that Julian Assange would be treated differently, they're going to have difficulty, because they have to go off of what Vanessa Baretzer had before her.
Right. And when the denial for extradition happened, there was a little bit of hope in the Assange camp and the people who have been wanting to see him be able to walk free. But then soon after, I think it was a week after, he was denied bail. And this, I know, is something that has upset you very much, as well as the people, of course, who are on Assange's legal team. And they're very confused. They don't understand how you can have one without the other. It seems somewhat contradictory to Assange's legal team. Can you explain your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's gonna sound like I'm in an argument with myself because I just told you that like Julian Assange's team is in a good position with the appeal, and I don't think I don't have a despondent attitude that it's a done deal that the U.S. government will be able to overcome the concerns of the judge and get the High Court of Justice to overturn and grant the extradition. But what my observation is of Vanessa Baretzer is that if you understand a thing or two about who she is as a career prosecutor, then it does make sense that she denied the extradition request and denied bail for Julian Assange, even though it's contradictory. I mean, it's true that it's contradictory because if you're really concerned about his mental health, you would let him out of high security prison so that he could be on house arrest with his family and he would not continue to go through the kind of stress that is wearing on him through this confinement. And during this pandemic, let's be clear, he's in essentially solitary confinement because it's a lockdown condition and there are no social visits permitted right now with the pandemic. So why would she do it this way? Well, I think it's a loophole, kind of. If you had reservations about this case and you didn't want to be held responsible for the likelihood that Julian Assange would kill himself in a U.S. prison, you would deny it. But if you were for the extradition, so you would deny it, and you deny him having bail. And what you hope for, if you're Vanessa Baretzer, is that the High Court of Justice approves the case, and then they're ever able to resolve the issues that you pointed out with the U.S. And then the High Court of Justice approves it. And if the High Court of Justice approves it, how do you think Vanessa Baretzer feels? I don't think she really cares, because in the end, the blood is no longer on her hands if Julian Assange kills himself. So she's not the one who's going to be dragged because she denied the extradition request. So I think that's, it's very clear to me in the way that she ruled. She's upholding the entire case that the U.S. is bringing. She's just saying on a technicality that she's denying the extradition request. And so to me, this just looks like a prosecutor who knows how people view this case, doesn't want to be on the wrong side of it, but doesn't want to take the step to truly protect Julian Assange's human rights, because then that might make it look like she's too much on the side of Julian Assange.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And let's assume for a second that the US tries to appeal the extradition denial. And like you said, the Assange team is in a good position now and it doesn't work. Where does that leave Assange? Right now, he's still in a Belmarsh prison. What happens next?
So you're asking if the U.S. government loses, what would happen?
Right.
If the U.S. government loses, they could appeal to the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, which I'd expect them to do. And again, if Assange's team were to lose this round, then it would be back to, so like in the Supreme Court, they would appeal the denial of, they would appeal that the appeal was granted. It's a little confusing. They would appeal that the U.S. won in the appeals court. And you'd go all the way up. And I think the Supreme Court is actually where this case would end. So whatever decision, and then whoever won in the Supreme Court, that decision would be what the British Foreign Office would have to sign off on. So before the extradition can happen, there's essentially a kind of diplomatic sign-off that has to take place of handing over this life to the custody of the U.S. government. And so another thing I'll introduce here is, so whether they win or lose, the appeal process chugs along. But one thing I want to introduce here is that if the Justice Department under Joe Biden decides to take a different approach to this case, then maybe they don't want to spend the resources and energy in it. Maybe they feel like it's not really worth it. Maybe they feel like they've gotten enough out of it. I mean, one thing that preeminent scholar Noam Chomsky said to me when I was moderating a conversation with him and Daniel Ellsberg on the day of the decision is that if you believe in conspiracies, then this might be evidence of one to you because of the way the judge ruled, since it gives the Biden administration everything they could ever want. It makes it look like the Justice Department did due diligence and had total had really good grounds to bring this case against Julian Assange. But they don't have to worry about bringing Assange here and put him on trial and go through an entire mess that could make the Biden administration look bad. So it's to Noam, it was to Noam Chomsky, it was like what the Biden Justice Department might want is just to know that Julian Assange deserves prosecution, but they don't really want to go through the mess of having a trial.
Yeah, those are good points. And that's actually one thing I wanted to get into. So Obama had the opportunity to pardon not just Assange, but Snowden and other whistleblowers. Trump is in his final days in office and he's talking about a lot of pardons, but it doesn't seem to be coming for Assange or Snowden. Do we know at all how Biden and the Biden administration feel about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks?
We have the one answer that Joe Biden's campaign gave to a New York Times questionnaire earlier in the primary race. And I think it was actually still 2019 when he was asked this question. And I don't remember a lot of the specifics of his answer, but all I can say is very generally, he paid lip service to the ideas that underpin bringing a prosecution against Julian Assange, while at the same time suggesting that you have to be careful about who you prosecute because there is a First Amendment. So we took a kind of position that didn't really make it, it had nothing to do with any indication of what he would do. Where by comparison, Bernie Sanders was very clear that he would oppose a prosecution under the Espionage Act, where the government was deciding who is and is not a journalist. That's not a practice that the U.S. government to get into. Joe Biden was much more unclear and was deferential to the Justice Department position in this case. And so we don't know. Merrick Garland is the pick for Attorney General, and I don't find any evidence out there of him ever speaking about WikiLeaks or Julian Assange. I don't see any past involvement in anything related to the Espionage Act. He may have had a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit before him. Actually, I think he did. But that's not similar to this because that's a civil matter and it doesn't have anything to do with crimes. So I don't know, obviously he's going to believe that national security agencies have a right to protect their information. And he's going to believe that classified information is appropriately kept secret by these agencies. And he's probably not one to say that overclassification is a severe problem, even though it is. But that doesn't necessarily mean he would endorse pursuing this kind of case that could jeopardize the First Amendment. And so it's important to remember our history, that it was Obama who declined to bring a case against Assange immediately after Chelsea Manning was convicted by a U.S. military court.
Right. And this kind of all comes back to the Espionage Act again, because that is the biggest threat possibly to news outlets and journalists in America right now, actually around the world. But let's look at the Espionage Act again. What is it about this act that we could do something about? Who is the decision maker that would be able to definitively say, no, the Espionage Act cannot be used to target journalists or news outlets who are publishing classified material about the US government? What steps need to be taken? What type of organization, what new laws need to happen to definitively throw away the Espionage Act in these types of cases?
First off, the Attorney General so Merrick Garland, if he becomes Attorney General, can say that he's not going to use the Espionage Act like this anymore. So it's entirely up to the discretion of the Justice Department, because this has been their preferred way to handle leaks. And if you talk to someone like John Kiriakou, former CIA officer who was targeted in an Espionage Act prosecution and eventually pled out, he accepted an agreement where he pled to a separate charge that ended up getting rid of the Espionage Act charges that were against him. He pled to an Intelligence Identities Protection Act violation instead, which is a different matter. He will tell you that the government used to impose administrative penalties against people who leaked. You know, if you were having an affair with somebody and you leaked information to that person and it wasn't, you violated your professional responsibility, you wouldn't get an Espionage Act prosecution. You might get a ding on your work record. You might be demoted. You could maybe see some kind of impact on your salary or whatever. And, that you can think of things that could be penalties in the workplace if you did something that you shouldn't do. It didn't elevate it to you committed a felony and we need to destroy your life and you're never going to work in government ever again. It wasn't treated like that. But that's how the Justice Department has approached it, especially that was how they approached it under President Barack Obama. And so the Attorney General could say, we're just not going to bring these kinds of leak prosecutions anymore. That's not how we're going to do this. But that's not a guarantee that we have a future where journalists don't have to look over their shoulder and be wary of what's going to happen. So you need reform, and you can reform the Espionage Act. Ron Wyden has proposed reforms to the Espionage Act. I believe that Tulsi Gabbard and some other people have put forward suggested changes to the Espionage Act in the House. So last term of Congress, we did have Espionage Act reform legislation. Those would need to be reintroduced now that we started a new Congress. But those bills essentially remove certain language in the bill that makes it, a huge detriment to people. It's things like making it clear that the law could not be used against journalists, for example, making it clear that if the Espionage Act is going to be brought, it's truly going to be brought against government employees and not be used to target publishers or media organizations. Now, that's a good first step. Now, you could also make a case that the Espionage Act should just be abolished entirely because it's always targeted dissent. You could make a case that we shouldn't be talking about reforming it. But then we need to be really good and prepared with our talking points as journalists. And we need to know that the civil liberties organizations and press freedom organizations are going to be out there in front saying what they want next to fill that vacuum, because otherwise they're going to pass a law that is going to be, the 21st century version of the Espionage Act. And I'm not saying it's going to be worse, but it's going to be a new law that will last for the next 100 years that will potentially create cases that impact dissenters, just like what we've seen in the last century.
Okay, great. And I have two last questions for you, Kevin, that I ask every guest that comes on the podcast. But before I do, why don't you give listeners the different places, your Twitter, shadowproof.com, dissenter.substack.com. Go ahead and list the places where listeners can go to follow these updates.
Yeah, I got quite a few. So I'll be as quick as I can. Shadowproof.com, shadowproof.com. And then if you want to get updates on the Assange case and coverage of whistleblower stories, I curate a newsletter at dissenter.substack.com, dissenter.substack.com. And I'm the co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and I do a weekly show on YouTube on Thursdays called The Dissenter Weekly, covering whistleblower stories and providing WikiLeaks updates. So that's really where you can find it all.
Did you want to throw your Twitter out there as well?
At Gosztola, Gosztola, for my account, if you wanted to follow and get my opinions on anything that I'm following on in any given week.
Okay, great. And last two questions for you here. Question number one is Bitcoin. Are you a believer or not so much?
Well, I will say that I think it's something that we need to consider. I don't really have a good answer to it. I mean, I don't know. You ask guests that have no formed opinion. I'm open to it. It doesn't seem crazy. It seems like something that's going to enter journalism as a way of funding it. When I believe I'm on Rockfin, I think that they have tokens that are driven by the price of Bitcoin. So I recognize that there are a lot of people in journalism, especially independent voices, who have the potential to see their revenue increased if they allow this to be a way of receiving funds.
Okay. And last question for you today, Kevin, is are we living in a simulation?
Sure. I'm feeling like a simulation today. I'll say yeah, I mean everybody's posting about being in America, the TV show. So wouldn't it be just very simple to translate that into believing that we're in the last year of our life has been some massive experiment written by some sick, depraved screenwriter or scriptwriter. I think there are a number of people who have the anxiety and frustration has built up so much that they would be willing to at least tolerate that. So I'll go with that today.
Yeah, if I've talked about that before too. If there was any kind of exciting period of time to live through, at least in recent human history, this would be, one of those TV shows that you would pick. So that's not necessarily proof, but it's promising. All right, thank you, Kevin. Thanks for this great episode of the Credder Podcast, and I hope all of our listeners go and follow your work at Shadowproof.